So I'd now like to introduce and welcome our guest speaker for the lunchbox session, Rebecca Christopherson. Rebecca is the director, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Rebecca, of the Child Safe Organisations team at the Queensland Family and Child Commission. QCOS very much appreciates Rebecca's time and the team's time to come and present to members. They did so back in February this year, and they're back again to assist in building capacity of the community services sector around understanding our obligations arising from the Child Safe Organisations Act. So QCOS met with Rebecca and the team recently and shared some of the questions that the QCN raised at our last meeting around their obligations. And Rebecca has, I think, has incorporated the answers to some of those questions in her presentation today. This is intended to be a safe space for all of you to get what you need. So regardless of where you're at in your journey toward becoming a child safe organisation or maintaining your status as a child safe organisation, please do not hesitate to be popping your questions in the chat, and we'll gather those for Rebecca, and we'll have time at the end of the session today to be asking those questions. And if we don't get to all of them, Rebecca has kindly indicated that she's happy to take some of these on notice. So I think Rebecca will present for approximately 30-35 minutes, but we'll be flexible with that time. And as I said, I have time for questions at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to stop sharing and welcome Rebecca to present to us today. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's great to see so many people online and joining this session. I will share my screen because we've got a little bit of information to get through. So I've got a PowerPoint to keep us on track today. Let me just get that rolling. There we go. And yeah, like we said, if you have any questions throughout, please do pop them in the chat. I'll try to pause a couple of times throughout the presentation today to address any questions as we go along. And of course, there'll be time at the end. But yes, I am Rebecca. I'm the director here of the Child Safe Organisations team. We are somewhat a new team within the Queensland Family and Child Commission, and our countdown as of today says 103 days until the commencement of our Child Safe Organisation Act in Queensland. So we're getting close to those double digits now, and the anticipation is definitely building across the state. Let me slip through and just do a quick acknowledgement as well to echo what was already done this morning. Where I am, I want to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, to whom I pay my deepest respect. I want to also acknowledge the crucial role that First Nations communities, organisations and individuals play in safeguarding our children. Without cultural safety, First Nations children are not safe, and we know that a culturally safe environment is simply safer and a more empowering environment for all children. And that is something that is baked into the Child Safe Organisations Act, so something that we really believe is foundational here to child safeguarding efforts. I know that most of you are probably aware of the context and background for the Child Safe Organisations Act, but some may be joining and hearing about this for the first time. So I will briefly touch through a little bit of the story about why we are here today and the problem that this act is trying to solve. So up on the slide now, you can see our lovely country here and where everybody is at becoming a child safe organisation state. So Queensland is joining some other jurisdictions that are ahead of us on the child safe organisations journey. Our act passed last year, but others, as you can see on here, have been working with a child safe organisation scheme for quite some time. So we're not alone in Queensland, and we're not sort of setting out and striking out on our own with these laws. We're joined by other states and territories to lift this around the nation. And it's really beneficial for Queensland that we're moving at the time that we are, because we get the opportunity to learn from our colleagues in other jurisdictions around their rollout of their laws. So we meet with them and share resources and connect regularly, and we'll keep doing that as the years roll on to make sure that we're doing this in as nationally consistent way as possible. So some of your organisations may work across borders and have connection with colleagues in other jurisdictions who are well on their way to being a child safe organisation under the different acts. And I just want to acknowledge that, because there are some subtle differences across borders, but largely we're well aligned nationally on the approach being taken to both the child safe standards and reportable conduct scheme. The Queensland journey, of course, started in 2017, as with everyone else, with the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse when they released their final report. Following on from that, in 2021, there was targeted consultation on the Growing Child Safe Organisations in Queensland paper, which sought feedback from the community about our approach to implementing the recommendations from that Royal Commission. We at the QFCC provided a submission back then. We weren't driving this at that time, but were one of many voices that spoke up in support of the laws and the recommendations made in the Royal Commission. So in 2024, when the Act was passed in Queensland in Parliament last year in September, the QFCC was actually put forward as the oversight body for these new laws, which is a new function for the QFCC, a new area for people to work in. So we're all on the sort of learning journey together, I suppose, in Queensland. We now have until the 1st of October when the first phase of the Act comes in. And I use that phrase first phase quite intentionally because this is not a sprint of legislation implementation here. It's a marathon. We've got 6 phases of implementation that will start from the 1st of October, but continue right to 2027. So each sector's come on under different parts of this Act at different times and different requirements apply. So that's a really important thing to call out from the start. When I say 1 October, that may not apply to your organisation. You may be in a later phase. So just let's sit with that and I'll come back to the phased implementation approach in a little bit. Now, why for the phased implementation? Why not just everything live on the 1st of October? Well, some organisations have a long way to go in this space. Others are well aware of child safeguarding practices, understand their mandatory reporting requirements. Everyone's had blue cards, since day dot. And this is going to be really comfortable spaces for them. But not everyone captured by this Act is starting from that strong point. Some of the organisations that'll be captured, their workers may not even need to have blue cards at the moment. They may have very little regulation in place, very few requirements on them. So some sectors need a little bit more time to come into compliance and a bit more support from us at the QFCC. So that's one of the reasons for that phased approach that I mentioned. Now, I'm glad that you put up that slide at the start with those support resources because, of course, we're not talking about light and fluffy content here. The problem that we're trying to solve here with this Act is significant and substantial and is having lifelong impact on children as they go through their lives. So I've got some stats up here that won't be of a surprise necessarily, but they do go some way to state the size of the problem. This information came from the 2023 Australian Child Maltreatment Study, which did a random sample of about 8,500 Australians aged between 16 and 65, and they found that over 23% of those people had experienced one or more types of contact child sexual abuse. Of those respondents, those who had been abused as children, more than 3/4 experienced that on repeated occasions, not just one time. The data collected through the Australian Bureau of Statistics in 2021 and 2022 Personal Safety Survey estimates that there are at least 195,200 people in Australia right now who were sexually abused before the age of 15 within an institution. So this is translated to almost 50,000 applications to the National Redress Scheme for compensation. That was one of the other things that Royal Commission in 2017 established. So this is a significant sized problem here. And I've also got up on this slide a bit of an indication of reports that those other jurisdictions that are a bit ahead of us in their implementation have received since their versions of their acts went live. So I've got up there in New South Wales in 2023-24, they had almost 2,500 notifications of reportable conduct within that jurisdiction, and you can see almost 4,000 in Victoria in that time frame. So there's a significant volume that we're expecting to receive in Queensland along these lines when our reportable conduct scheme goes live as well. And so I hope that everyone can kind of understand the why here and the problem that we're trying to solve with this new Act that's commencing shortly. And I've got up here, I guess, just an indication of the landscape in Queensland and the many different checks and balances and bodies that are existing right now before this Act is commenced that are trying to solve these problems. So we've got lots of regulatory bodies in Queensland. Of course, we've got the Queensland Police Service, we've got child safety, we've got mandatory reporting laws. We have HR practices where we're doing sort of pre-employment checks, and we've got blue cards, there's oversight bodies, there's complaint mechanisms. And all of these things are working extremely hard. There's a lot of people trying to solve these problems and prevent harm from occurring and respond to it when it does occur. But each of these cogs, as I've got them up here, are slightly different. They're moving in slightly different ways. They've got slightly different thresholds, slightly different powers. They've got their own information sharing limitations that sort of prevent information being shared to those who might need it. And they've all got their challenges, their bottlenecks, their cultural drivers for what they're hearing about or what they're not hearing about. And these laws are not going to change those things. We're going to add to them, basically. So I've got in here the child safe standards sitting above these cogs. And that's because the child safe standards are unifying sort of baseline expectations of all child serving entities or child safe organisations, as you might hear them called. So these are the minimum expectations, the minimum requirements, and something that when a child, is dropped off in an organisation, their parent or carer can trust that those minimum standards are being followed. Then at the bottom, we've got our reportable conduct scheme. And that, again, is a single unifying expectation of reporting that applies to all those reporting entities who have children spending significant amount of time within their walls. So it sets an expectation that, no matter which one of those reporting entities you fall in, certain information has to be reported to the QFCC and has to be investigated. And this is kind of new. Not all of these reports currently get investigated within an organisation. But we're coming in around this system trying to be the glue, trying to solve the gaps, fill those gaps, and make sure that prevention of harm and response to harm is moving in a predictable way for everyone involved in these complex systems. The laws themselves have those two parts that I mentioned, the child safe standards and the reportable conduct scheme. So child safe standards and the universal principle, they're all about harm prevention. And reportable conduct scheme is all about what to do if harm does occur within one of those organisations. And in Queensland, these two spheres, they touch. They're being done together within one organisation. Now, that may be different in other jurisdictions. They may have split these functions across different organisations, or in fact, they might not have both of them yet. We've got both coming in Queensland, and they're touching for a reason, because we really believe that in order for organisations to be child safe, that we've got to keep these two ideas of prevention and response together. So at the end of a reportable conduct investigation within an organisation, when something has gone wrong, we want to make sure that organisations are stepping back into harm prevention and learning from that experience, whether those allegations were substantiated or not. And that's how it's going to work in Queensland. So these two systems will be really intrinsically linked. The legislation that we've got is, as you would expect, all about protecting children from harm and promoting their safety. It's the legislation that establishes the 10 child safe standards in Queensland and the universal principle of cultural safety, as well as that reportable conduct scheme. And it also names the Queensland Family and Child Commission, where I work, as the oversight body. The Act talks about child safe entities, which means any entity that provides services specifically for children or provides facilities specifically for children who are under the supervision of that entity. Now, that is broad. We estimate about 40,000 organisations will be captured within that definition. And some organisations are sort of borderline here. They're wondering if they're in scope or they're out of scope, and it's not always completely clear cut, because the Child Safe Organisation Act applies at the organisation level, not at the service level. So in Queensland, we've got really big organisations doing all sorts of different services, some for adults, some for children. But if you have those services specifically for children that are being offered within your organisation, then the organisation must be child safe. You have questions about scope, we're going to be releasing some more guidance in the future around that to help people figure out where they land on this requirement. But for our purposes, if you are wondering if you're in scope and if you're one of those borderline organisations, you can opt in. If you may technically not be captured, we still encourage you to review those child safe standards and think about how they might apply within your organisation, and do your best to lift that bar and make sure that all those children walking through your doors or accessing your services are safe. So the Child Safe Organisations Act is structured in this way, and we've got a framework coming that supports this as recommended by that Royal Commission, and we've got that integrated system coming together now. So this is just another way to sort of picture that side. We've got the Child Safe Standards and a reportable conduct scheme. And the reportable conduct scheme sets those expectations for how allegations or convictions of harm that are happening within an organisation need to be investigated and responded to. Talk about that a little bit later, but let's start with the standards, because prevention is obviously the goal that we're really reaching for here. If these child safe standards and universal principles are really well embedded within an organisation, it's hoped that that will minimise the number of reportable conduct allegations that might arise in that service. So we have 10 standards here, and these are supported, or central, I suppose, to these is the universal principle. So universal principle is about cultural safety. And that may be a term that's not really familiar to you or that you haven't come across a lot. In many organisations that I've been speaking to, I think a lot of work has been done around cultural competence and cultural awareness and those sorts of really important training areas. But cultural safety is a little bit different. And if it's a term that you're not familiar with, that's okay, because there's a lot of information out there to support unpack that for you. The 10 standards themselves are probably not going to blow your brain out. They're not going to make you total, like they're not going to spin your mind and make you think that these are totally outside anything that you've done before. You're probably looking at that list of 10 and going, yep, we are well aware of this. We've been working on these sorts of things for many years now. And that's a great foundation to start from. The standards are looking to emphasize all the things that drive quality engagement with children, and it's about culture and leadership, children being active in decisions about themselves and having a voice, having recruitment practices that are really robust and making sure that you're vetting people appropriately and doing those reference checks. And it's about supporting and training staff within organizations and volunteers to make sure everyone knows the expectations of them at all times. It's about promoting the safety of both physical and online environments too, that those children are accessing. And perhaps up until this point, your organization has been all over the physical side of it, but online environments might be an area where there's some room for improvement. So they've been called out explicitly here because children are spending a lot of time online. And as the responsible adults, we need to be confident that we're keeping those online engagements safe for those children. And it's also baking in that idea of continuous improvement, which I think is my favorite of all the standards, because there's always more to be done in this space. Even if right now you're looking down this list and going, we are sound, we've got policies and procedures, everyone knows what we're doing, everyone's working the right way, and our organization is really meeting these 10 standards. Tomorrow, the needs of children and families in your community may change. That may change in 5 years. That will change into the future. We know that. So those sorts of practices that have worked well up into a point, at some point, we need to revisit and ask ourselves, are we still doing the best we can in all of these spaces? So sitting with this and thinking of it as a marathon, not a sprint. It's not a one-time checklist of 10 requirements and off we go, we're compliant. We've got to bake this stuff in. We've got to make sure that we're coming back to these 10 standards and thinking about them critically regularly and moving our practice and improving things when we need to. And I tend to think, and maybe I'm projecting onto the wise people that wrote this legislation, that they put policies and procedures at the bottom of the list for a reason. Because policies and procedures are great. Of course, they're incredibly important and foundational, but it's really our interactions, our culture within an organization, the way that we're engaging with families and children, the way that we're embracing diversity that's important. You can have really good, strong policies and procedures, but if they're not translated into practice, then they're not going to keep those children safe. So they're on there and they're very important, but they're not the be all and end all. So you might be asking yourself, I already know all about the national principles. They've been out for a long time. Do I also need to educate myself on these Queensland ones if we're nationally aligned? And the answer to that is yes, because we have our universal principle. And that is one of the points of difference in the Queensland implementation of the Royal Commission recommendations. Now, some jurisdictions have made cultural safety like an 11th standard. Others have adopted it as a universal principle as we have, like in Tasmania, but that is something that might not be the same as what you're aware of and is not so clearly called out in those national principles. So cultural safety, that universal principle, is a point of difference in Queensland and is worth engaging with. So if you're meeting the National Child Safe Standards and the Universal Principle, do you need to meet these requirements? Well, definitely. This legislation is applying in Queensland, like I said, from the 1st of October. So that is when our active presence and monitoring of sectors will begin. That's when the regulation kicks in. So compliance is very important. And if you're choosing there and you're not quite sure, are you supposed to comply with the national principles or with the Queensland principles? First, again, they're very aligned, but in Queensland, that's what we need to follow. That's our law. So that's where those national principles have been adopted and embedded straight into the legislation as a requirement. So you do need to be aware of the 10 child safe standards in Queensland and the universal principle in Queensland. Let's talk a little bit about child safety and cultural safety. So the development of the Child Safe Organisations Act in Queensland has rightly prioritised cultural safety for First Nations people under the scheme. The evidence from the Royal Commission found that a strong connection to culture is a really important protective factor against child sexual abuse. As the oversight body, we know that we have to get this aspect right because this is how Queensland has prioritised that universal principle. So we've included it as a guiding principle that must underpin all 10 of those child safe standards rather than be an 11th standard. Because without cultural safety, an organisation can't be child safe. We're continuing to develop advice and guidance on the universal principle, and we'll be doing that for years to come. We will keep adding to our understanding of what this looks like when it's done well, practical measures that organisations can take. But at the start, it's important to understand the definitions and guidance around what is a culturally safe environment. And that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people must themselves define and measure cultural safety. That knowledge, skills, and attitudes of individuals to address and recognise bias and stereotypes need to be really developed within an organisation, and diversity needs to be embraced. And that organisations may need to transform their systems so that they work better for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and children. So this is a continuous journey for everybody, and cultural safety is going to be an ongoing area that, like I said, we'll be unpacking, adding more resources to, and guiding in the implementation as the years go on. At the moment, there's a lot you can find online already if you need to get a more foundational understanding of cultural safety. Of course, SNAKE has guidance on what this looks like. And within our guidelines, which I'll speak about a little bit more later, we've gone to great pains to try to articulate practical examples of what cultural safety looks like under each of those 10 standards. So in practice, that would mean that there's clear organisational leadership, governance, and culture that prioritises cultural safety, that those First Nations communities, elders, and leaders are engaged with regularly and meaningfully to ensure that policies are culturally appropriate, responsive, and safe. And sometimes when I speak about this, organisations will say, well, we don't have any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children accessing our service, so we don't need to be culturally safe. And I guess that's one of those questions to sit with and hold up to the light and examine as to whether, if you don't have any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in your organisation right now, how do you know it's appearing culturally safe to them? So think about the sort of information you've got online, think about your signage and what's, local community engagement you're doing to give the message out there that you are a safe organisation. I'm certainly not implying that not having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children means you're not culturally safe, but it is something to think about and to question and examine about whether it's clear from the outside, and whether if you asked a First Nations person, would they say yes? So that's the sort of work that goes into a little bit more detail in our guidelines, and that we'll be continuing to unpack as time goes on. So how will this system work in Queensland? So we've got these laws, we've got these 10 standards and this universal principle. What's the QFCC going to do? So the first thing we're going to do is continuously provide information, support, guidance, and resources. This is our main purpose in this area. We know that most organisations want to be child safe. They just may need some help to understand how to do that well. And that's what we're here to do. So our primary purpose, I suppose, when it comes to the child safe standards is support and guidance. And we're going to stay with that as the years go on. Once we're live from the 1st of October and in those phases that unfolded, we may receive complaints from people who don't believe that an organisation they've engaged with has been child safe. or it may be intelligence that we receive, not necessarily from complaints, but through all sorts of avenues. And when we get that sort of information, we'll be examining it, triaging it, maybe seeking some information from those organisations about their approach to being child safe. If we want to, we have powers under that Act to issue what's called a directed self-assessment. So that's one of the things that we would do, depending on risk and triage and competing priorities, of course. You may receive a direction from the QFCC to do a self-assessment. And that would be taking you through guided questions and asking you to attach evidence of compliance throughout. That would then come back to the QFCC to assess the response and, if necessary, provide some information and guidance back to you as an organisation on areas to improve. We've also got the ability to share information across agencies. So there's lots of regulators working in this space, and we'll be working together in a collaborative way to make sure organisations are child safe and referring information to the organisation who's best placed to support or respond to any issues. And we do have the ability to take compliance action under our legislation. So this is a little different if you're aware of the Human Rights Act. There's all sorts of requirements in there, of course, but they don't have the kinds of powers to issue enforceable undertakings or compliance directions that others have. We do have those powers under our Act, but we'll be using those in a way that it's targeted to organisations that are unwilling and unable to be child safe, which we know is not the majority of organisations. But I think the reality is, if in order for these child safe standards to have the effect that that Royal Commission was trying to achieve, we've got to have the ability to follow through. And the legislation allows for that. But like I said, and I can't stress this enough, our primary goal is education, support and guidance, and we will stay in that space as long as we can with an organisation. Now, there's going to be some challenges to this, of course. We don't know the volume of complaints and issues that might come to us. We've got to arrange those information sharing protocols with those other regulators who are doing similar work, and we're already speaking to them now. So HSQF is an organisation we've been partnering with a lot to make sure that their standards are aligning with the child safe standards and that their approach to doing checks and accreditation will align with our approach, with that focus on information, advice and guidance in the first instance. There will be difficulties sometimes in sharing information. We may have broader powers to share than other organisations have to share with us. And these are the sorts of issues that we'll need to be working through as the years go on. But you can rest assured that we're very focused on staying with this work, following it through and making sure that people have a firm understanding of what a child safe organisation looks like. So I really encourage you to sign up to our newsletter, check our website, and reach out if there's any particular thing that you wish you had under these 10 standards to help you understand them that you can't find. That's what we're here. Those are the gaps that we're here to fill. I'm just going to pause for a second there, and before I talk about the reportable conduct scheme, just to see if there's any questions around the child safe standards, the universal principle, or the approach we'll be taking once that goes live.
We do have one question from Zane Morgan. I'm
Great.
not sure, Zane, if your question has been answered by a couple of the links that have been put in the chat and information Rebecca shared after your question. But the question,
gosh, look at all the links.
The question was, cultural safety has multiple dimensions. I'm curious if you may be able to share how this universal principle is being defined in this instance, which I think you did cover. But Zane, are you happy to come off mute and just, is there any further element to your question? Or just
sorry, I was
yep.
just trying to come off mute. Yes, it
That's
has.
okay.
Thank you very much. I think, yeah, one of the things is, depending on, different avenues, different spaces, we have cultural safety policies in government, we have cultural safety policies in unions, we have lots of different cultural safety kind of definitions and things that float around. And, sometimes they are defined by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. My understanding of, cultural safety and what that looks like for me is very different to what cultural safety looks like for someone else, and how we define that looks different. But I know when we're talking about a universal principle, I was wondering just kind of what that looks like in this instance.
Yes, it's very much defined in our guidelines as to what we're looking for, and we obviously partnered with First Nations in developing that approach and definition. But I hope that that information in those guidelines is helpful. And like I said, we'll continue to unpack this as needed into the years that the months, I suppose, ahead to start with.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Zane.
Can see a question there about HSQF, actually a couple of those, as well as early childhood programs. So yeah, HSQF is one of the partners that we've been engaging with the most in order to align their licensing or accreditation approach, which we understand happens on a cycle nature with the child safe standards. And we've been working with them around their handbook and their guidelines that they give to their auditors and speaking to their auditors directly about the approach. So yes, definitely well aligned with them in the work going forward. And it's something, of course, we're going to have to sit with as years go by to make sure that we're moving together in our approach to regulation under this Act. I know that they've got their own terminology and their own requirements. I think they're called non-conformance under their approach. And we've been talking to them about how that's going to work under the child safe standards and what to do. And certainly we understand that they have a risk-based framework as well. So we're very much working to make sure that we're aligned on what matters would be a sort of a high level risk that they may find and what to do with those things. And like I said, the phrase I'll keep coming back to is unwilling and unable to comply with the child safe standards would be that high level risk, and what they'll do with that information if and when it comes to the attention of their auditors, and how we'll manage that. So we'll have clear protocols for sharing that information back and forth and determining who's best placed to support that organisation to come into compliance, or if there's just not that ability to comply, take that action needed under that compliance framework that we've got and those powers. Same with early childhood. So the national quality standards have been around since 2012 when it comes to early childhood programs, and they've been assessed against the national principles, the child safe standards, and found to be very much in alignment. Where there's a couple of gaps in there, such as like expressly calling out online programs, we know that there's been work happening nationally to fill those gaps and align the national quality rating system to be as closely aligned with the child safe standards as possible. But they're another one of our partners in making sure that this is successful. So we'll be working with them again to clarify that information sharing back and forth, determining, if we receive a complaint about an early childhood service, whether it stays with us or it goes over to that regulator to look into it, and vice versa, if they receive a complaint that appears to be really within our basket of responsibilities, whether they send it to us to look into. So lots of information to go on, and lots of information sharing to be determined in those sort of protocols. And we really want to make sure that the sectors understand as well from their side how that information is going to flow and who they're going to be hearing from. We know from other jurisdictions that one of the largest areas that they receive those reportable conduct notifications is in early childhood. So that is a really important thing for us to get right. I know that nationally too, the timeframes for notifying incidents to the childcare regulator have changed, which may mean that the order in which different organisations are advised of things, they may hear things before we hear things, and that's, so it's complex. I'm not going to lie, but there's certainly really strong commitment across government to work together to make this work in as least administratively burdensome way possible. I'm trying to monitor the chat here, see if there's any more questions I can answer. Will organisations be required to be accredited for both HSQF and child safe standards? Well, we don't have an accreditation system under the child safe standards, which is a good thing in many ways, I think, because that would be a lot of extra administrative burden on these 40,000 organisations, but it also means that we're not necessarily going to have a comprehensive list at any particular time about who they are, which does mean that we will be hearing from the public, we imagine, as one of our main sources if we are to take action or to ask questions of an organisation on whether they're compliant. It will likely be in that reactive space predominantly. So HSQF will continue to be, for those organisations that fall within their area, accredited by HSQF. They've just looked to align their requirements with the child safe standards as far as we can. I can see a link in there has gone for the newsletter, which I saw there was a question about before. So really do encourage you to sign up for the newsletter. In relation to compliance action, is it possible to understand how this might look for organisations unwilling and unable to comply? What is the action? Great question. So we've got a couple of powers under that Act. One is to issue a compliance direction to an organisation, which basically tells them the steps that they must take to come into compliance. We also have the ability to enter into an enforceable undertaking with an organisation. So that is basically, if an organisation were to make certain promises to us about how they'll improve their practice under the child safe standards, an enforceable undertaking makes that a committed promise, something that if those things are then not done, can go to court to be sort of upheld. From what we know, again, from those other jurisdictions who are ahead of us, they've very rarely, if ever, used their compliance powers because they haven't needed to, which is wonderful. Usually what happens is they're giving that advice and guidance back as a result of a self-assessment or an information request, and an organisation has been very willing to act on those suggestions and take those steps to come into compliance. So others haven't had to use their powers too much. Hopefully we have the same effect here in Queensland, and we get to stay in that education support and guidance space as long as possible. There's a comment here about Blue Card being currently reviewed by the QFCC and any information about what the compliance space might look like. Also another great question, not something I can speak to today, unfortunately, but I would say that's happening in another part of the QFCC. And I know that there's information coming out regularly around that review and what they're finding in discussion papers and whatnot. So the QFCC newsletter is the best way to stay up to date with that review and what they're finding and those recommendations that will come. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to pause there on child safe standards questions, but like I said, we're monitoring the chat, so we'll come back to those after the event if there's anything that's not covered off in the remainder of the presentation. I'm still sharing, good. All right, let's talk about the reportable conduct scheme, because this is, I guess, as opposed to the child safe standards, which are more of an outcomes-based, softer requirement in terms of, like I said, we're not accrediting organisations as being child safe in the QFCC. We don't have that power. We do have much stronger requirements when it comes to reportable conduct, and for good reason. Because reportable conduct is defined as those things you can see up on the screen right now: allegations or convictions around a child sexual offence, sexual misconduct in relation to or in the presence of a child, ill treatment of a child, significant neglect of a child, physical violence in relation to or in the presence of a child, and behaviour that causes significant emotional or psychological harm to a child. Now that's pretty broad. And that, given those definitions, you can understand why other jurisdictions are seeing sort of thousands of these notifications coming through each year, because it's a broad amount of conduct that will have to be reported under this scheme. So what this means, I suppose, another thing to keep in mind is that reportable conduct applies in a narrower scope of services. So I mentioned before, we've got 40,000 services that will be regulated under the child safe standards. We estimate about 10,000 services come under the reportable conduct scheme. So it's a narrower list, it's a smaller number of services, and that's, again, quite intentional, because we're talking about reportable conduct that is happening within an organisation by an employee or volunteer of that organisation. It's really coming back to that institutionalised violence and sexual abuse that the Royal Commission was talking about. And that is predominantly happening within organisations that have sort of extended time with children, and children are left there, without a parent or guardian. So there's that extra care and those extra opportunities for things to happen. Reportable conviction is obviously a conviction of an offence committed by a worker against a state or law or of the Commonwealth that may involve reportable conduct. So most of what we'll probably be dealing with will be those allegations rather than the convictions themselves. Now, this scheme is very much designed to protect children from harm and uphold their rights to safety and well-being, and ensure that when a reportable allegation happens, a predictable and transparent response follows, and that will include investigation. So the reportable conduct scheme will apply regardless of that sort of criminal level of threshold. It is an allegation of these things happening within an organisation. And it's important to note that making a report of reportable conduct to the QCC is not optional. So the Child Safe Organisations Act does have penalties associated with failing to report reportable conduct. So if you're the head of a reporting entity and you don't give us written notice about an allegation or conviction involving that reportable conduct on the screen, you may be prosecuted. Like I said, I don't think other jurisdictions have had to take a lot of action in this space. I think if anything, people are perhaps over-reporting in an abundance of caution, and that's perfectly fine. If we receive a report of reportable conduct that doesn't meet the definition and didn't need to come to us, we'll come back and we'll tell you. We'll clarify an understanding there and take that as an opportunity to, again, educate, support, and guide on what compliance looks like. Now, we're working through sort of a reportable conduct scheme on a page at the moment to unpack this in a bit more detail, but there is still plenty of time to prepare for this one. So the reportable conduct scheme commences in Queensland on the 1st of July 2026, and again will be a phased approach for different parts of the sector and for a smaller proportion of the sector. We will keep releasing information, handbooks, guidance, definitions, all sorts of things over the next 12 months before this commences, and we'll keep doing that into the future as well. We'll also, of course, have to have a reporting system created in order to make this as seamless and easy a report to make to us, preferably electronically. So lots of work happening right now to develop that system. So how does reportable conduct work? An organisation will have to report to us reportable conduct, and as a result, the organisation will need to tell us some information about the allegation, as well as how they're protecting children from harm and who else they've had to report that to. Because obviously we're entering a rather saturated reporting market here, and we understand that referrals and notifications are probably also being made to the police, to another sector regulator, like the early childhood regulator, for example, possibly to child safety. So there's going to be a lot of coordinating here in the QFCC to make sure that we're only stepping in when someone else is not doing what needs to be done in relation to investigating those allegations. But by being there and by receiving all those notifications, if I can take you back to that COG slide at the start, we are setting a minimum standard of information that has to be reported to a central body. So that's going to mean it's not, it doesn't have to be at the criminal level. So the Queensland Police Service won't be responsible for holding this data and tracking this information. It'll be the QFCC. What we'll be doing as well is we've got those information sharing powers along the way. So if a reportable conduct allegation happens within an organisation, it's notified to us along with some mandatory information to give us the information we need to understand that notification. We then the system is designed that the organisation is then to investigate that reportable conduct. So that may not be something that every organisation is really comfortable with or is doing at the moment. We know that lots of referrals are made to Queensland Police Service, of course, but organisations may not be investigating those allegations themselves. So first and foremost, the Queensland Police Service needs to advise whether they're investigating it or not. But after that, the organisation needs to take steps to investigate it and make sure that the children or child at the centre of the notification is protected from harm. We then must be notified at the end of the investigation as to the outcome. Was the allegation substantiated or not? And this is that glue that holds the system together, because substantiated allegations can then be shared by us to Blue Card services, even if it's not a criminal level of conviction. And that may trigger Blue Card to do a reassessment of suitability, or may not. They have their own legislation and their own frameworks. But at the moment, what we have is a system that is allowing these allegations to be made, to not be investigated, to not be reported, and for there to be no tracking of patterns, allegations, possible offenders over time. We have no ability to know if people are moving from one regulated sector to another and engaging in similar alleged conduct. This reportable conduct scheme is designed to fill those gaps, to create a unifying minimum level expectation of behaviours that must be reported and investigated and can be shared with the people who can make reassessments of suitability if they need to. And like I said at the start, what we really hope for in this space is at the end of a reportable conduct investigation that the organisation turns back into prevention mode, returns to the child safe standards and reassesses anything that they need to learn a lesson from that experience and that investigation and how it was conducted. I can see lots of activity in the chat there, and I know that reportable conduct is probably the area that makes people the most nervous. Like I said, there's over 12 months before this commences and much more information to come from the QFCC about how it's going to work. Let's talk a little bit. I'll just check the chat and see if there's any particular questions in there that I can answer before going on to talk about scope. Let me see. How does reportable conduct interact with mandatory reporting to child safety? Great question. It's an addition to that. So mandatory reporting continues as a requirement of mandatory reporters. What we'll need to know when you make a reportable conduct notification is, was a mandatory report made? And there may be circumstances where not everyone is making mandatory reports. So we're another sort of line, I guess, or a check and balance in this system to make sure that those mandatory reports are being made, and we can make sure that we've got information sharing going on with child safety around that. So child safety will be one of those collaborative agencies that we'll be working with to make sure that this is rolled out in an effective manner. Earlier, the explanation of reportable conduct focused on employees. Will it capture reportable conduct of volunteers? Yes, yes. But like I said, it's a narrower definition of who's a reporting entity. So just because you're in scope of the child safe standards does not mean that you're also captured by the reportable conduct scheme. Now, there's a lot of information on our website around this to figure out if your organisation is subject to both systems or just the child safe standards. So if you're not totally clear on that, I do recommend looking it up. It's in the Act itself too. It's defined who a reporting entity is. And like I said, it is a narrower scope. So be aware of that. You may not be subject to the reportable conduct scheme, but of course, everyone has a voice to play. If disclosures are made, if allegations are made, please do send those to the police and to child safety and be a responsible actor in this safeguarding system. Reportable conduct is not going to be all things to all organisations. You have to sort of set your limits somewhere, but I think every sort of responsible adult has a voice and a responsibility to respond if allegations are made that involve harm to children. All right, I don't see any more questions there, so let me keep going and talk a little bit about scope. So the scope is really important, and figuring out which of these requirements apply to you and when they apply to you is critical. So some of you may work for organisations that deliver multiple different types of services that come into scope of this Act at different times. Our advice to you is to come on as early as you can when it comes to being compliant. So if you're working in an organisation that has some services, I'll just bring up the next slide, it might help. So if you've got some child protection services being offered within your organisation, as well as health and community services, phase 1 is when child protection services need to come into compliance, and that is the time your organisation should come on board to be in compliance. Let me go back to the other slide just before we go. If you're not sure if your organisation is providing services or facilities specifically for children, then that is something that you need to unpack to understand if this applies to you, if you are in scope of the child safe standards. So consider the intent and the focus of your service. Consider how it's advertised, how people are coming through your door. Are you predominantly for adults, and 99% of the people that you're servicing are adults, but occasionally you get the odd 17-year-old into your service? Well, I don't think that that's a service provided specifically for children, and that's the intent of this Act. But if you're not sure, you've got our email address there on the screen, cso@qfcc.qld.gov.au. Explain your service to us and your organisation, and we can help you unpack whether and how the child safe organisation applies to you. And like I said, we will be publishing some guidance soon that organisations can kind of work through and ask some questions to help determine those borderline cases. And if in doubt, always check the Act itself. It's actually pretty good legislation. It's pretty clearly drafted, and that schedule at the back, which lists out all the different types of organisations which are captured, is pretty good. It's just some organisations are incredibly complex with their service offerings, so it's not always super clear cut, and we acknowledge that. I will talk a little bit more about that phase time frame now. So this is a diagram that's on our website. It might be a little hard to see on the screen now, but basically the top of it is the timeline around the teal areas of the child safe standards, and they describe the different times at which different types of organisations must come into compliance with the child safe standards. Then in the bottom, we've got in orange the reportable conduct scheme, which, like I said, is a narrower selection of services. So obviously for the audience I'm speaking to now, you'll see that community services features under the child safe standards. It is not featured under the reportable conduct scheme. Community services are not part of the reportable conduct scheme. But if you're at one of those large organisations that provides community services along with health services, along with education and care services, then your organisation will be in scope. But those elements of it won't be. I know that this is complex. I acknowledge that. So we've got more guidance to come, like I said, around this scope question. But the reason for this phased approach, like I said at the start, is to allow some of these sectors which have minimal checks and balances existing and minimal regulation in place time to come into compliance and for us to work with them so that they're set up for success under this scheme. And it also allows us to have a phased pipeline of our focus and our engagement with sectors as they come on. When you're dealing with 40,000 organisations, we need to break that up in some way to make sure that we can target our communications and our engagement across those different sectors. It gives everyone time to get ready. So what does compliance look like? If you're a 1 October organisation coming in scope of the child safe standards, what do you need to be compliant? First off, being at this webinar is a really good start because it shows a level of awareness. We expect you to be aware of the requirements, to be considering the resources and self-assessment tool we've got available and taking steps to be compliant under the child safe standards. This next bit is more about aligning with community service practice and the HSQF team. It's something I've already spoken about a bit, so I won't go into too much more detail about it. But other than to say the HSQF user guide is being updated to outline the requirements for that organizations need to meet for those organizations who need to achieve external certification. And it can be used as guidance when developing quality systems and processes that shape the service delivery. So there's work underway already, and we've been able to be part of that, which we're very grateful to the HSQF for partnering with us around. For regulators in community service and more generally, we're establishing a collaborative regulators network and completing functional alignment assessments with each of the other regulators we'll need to be working with. And this will help us create that network, share information, work together on our protocols for investigating and responding to complaints, and make sure that things are as smooth and administratively burdensomeless, I don't think that's a word, but I'll use it anyway, as possible. We want to emphasize that many community service organizations already meet several child safe standard elements. And this is really about strengthening and documenting what you already do and leveraging your existing HSQF compliance, risk assessments, and safeguarding policies. So our role as the statutory body is to work with those other educators and, those other regulators, and like I said, to educate and build capability across sectors. We do have the ability to monitor compliance and take compliance action, like I've mentioned about, and to exchange information. That's where we're the glue in the system, closing any gaps that exist at the moment. But as I hope I've said it many times now, but I'll say it one more time, our role is to empower and enable sectors to lead the work for their composite entities. We want to be here to support organisations to come into compliance first and foremost. So we do get a lot of questions about the child and youth risk management strategies and the child safe standards. So all of you would be very familiar with child and risk youth management strategies, and you may have asked yourself, well, if you already have that, do you still need it? And how does it align with the child safe standards? So the introduction of the Child Safe Organisations Act marks a really significant shift for organisations that work with children. And for those transitioning to become child safe entities, the Act offers an opportunity to revisit and refresh your child and youth risk management strategy. In other words, please don't throw it out. When you come into compliance with the Child Safe Organisations Act, that child and risk youth management strategy that you've had probably for many, many years is a really important foundational document. And as you can see on the slide here, it maps very well. The requirements of that map quite closely to the requirements of the child safe standards. But it is a good opportunity to dig it out again, look at it, review it, and see if there are any gaps that can be filled now that the child safe standards have been released. So many of those mandatory requirements will continue there. So I hope that that answers that question around the child and youth management strategy. You may be able to give it a different name under once the Child Safe Organisations Act commences, of course. Those documents, though, please maintain them, review them, refresh them, and continue to use them into the future. They're very important and well understood. There's some resources and support available, which I would be remiss not to mention. So, of course, we have published guidelines, and they are very thorough on understanding the universal principle and the child safe standards in Queensland. And accompanying that is a self-assessment tool. So it's its companion piece. It's a Word document, it's editable, it's something for you to pick up as an organisation and use in a way that fits your organisation best. So you probably have quality improvement processes and practices and templates already. Weave the child safe standards into them would be my advice. We made it an editable Word document for that very reason, because we wanted it to be adaptable and flexible to suit your organisation. We'll be launching some free training on our website soon, videos, printable resources, plain language content. That will come out in the new financial year. And again, I'll plug our QFCC website to stay up to date with that. And we have recently run a grants program, which was well oversubscribed, lots of interest from different sectors around how they could be financially supported to be compliant with the child safe standards. And we are very hopeful we can run another grant round in the new financial year too. So sign up to our newsletter. If there's anything to announce, that's where it'll go. Within those guidelines, we do have, I pulled this out, this page 14 and 15, practical tips for organisations. Great place to start after this webinar to have a look at those steps and work through them and think about applying that. This is the sort of stuff when I'm asked, well, what does compliance look like? It's for organisations to engage with these sorts of materials and to show that they are taking action, they're doing their self-assessment, they're taking tangible steps to improve their child safeguarding approach, and they have that level of awareness of the child safe standards and how they apply within their organisation. The self-assessment tool, like I mentioned, is all about mapping strengths. It's practical, evidence-based reflection and is there to be helpful, to guide you, to give really practical, concrete examples of what you can do to be compliant. And it's flexible and adaptable. So if there's things within there that don't resonate with your particular organisation and the way that you do your work, that's okay. It's not a mandatory, you must do all the things on this checklist. It's supposed to be supportive and educative and guide you through that self-assessment process and give you a really firm understanding about what those standards are all about when you peel them back and dig into them in a little bit more detail. So I mentioned the training that will be coming up soon, short video modules freely available on our website. And that will be available next financial year as early as we can get it out there. It'll include things like a facilitated guide. So if you wanted to take a staff meeting within your organisation and work through the requirements of the child safe standards, reportable conduct scheme. It's designed to support those sorts of on-the-ground learning and lessons, and plenty of opportunities for resources within there to print out and use. And we'll keep providing as much information as we can in as many forums as we can. It's a very big job to get 40,000 organisations aware of this to begin with. So we do have radio ads going. We've got print and other media ads coming just to raise that awareness. But I would take this opportunity to just call upon each of you, 172 people online right now, to please talk about the Child Safe Organisations Act, to talk about the child safe standards. I'm sure you're all involved in various community level organisations, sporting clubs. Talk to parents about it, talk to children about it. The more awareness we can get of the child safe standards, the more likely we'll be able to lift and have the impact that we're seeking here to prevent harm and keep all children safe whenever they're engaging with an organisation. So please do spread the word as much as you can. I know I'm Trojan horsing this meeting with that message, but it really does go a long way. We know that just raising awareness is probably the most important part of this scheme and making it successful. In the meantime, if you're looking for training before ours goes live, if you just can't wait, we do have all sorts of it linked on our website that are provided by other organisations such as NAPCAN and the Australian Human Rights Commission. So if you can wait for ours to come out in the new financial year, great. But if you're ready and wanting to get started, there's lots of resources to get moving on at the moment. So what do you need to do now? Understand your obligations, the timeframes, whether and when you need to come into compliance with the child safe standards and reportable conduct scheme. You need to learn about the child safe standards in more detail, look at the guidelines, work through that self-assessment. We also recommend organisations have a champion or a group of individuals to sort of lead this work. But I say that with a little bit of reservation because sometimes I think what that can turn into is one person becoming responsible for an entire organisation. And I think hopefully you've got the impression from today that that's not going to be successful, that the whole purpose of the child safe standards is to bring everyone onto the same page about child safeguarding and what it looks like. So making one person responsible for that within an organisation is probably not going to have the impact that we're seeking here. We need everyone who is engaging with children in volunteer or in employment capacity to know what to do if that child makes a disclosure, to know who to contact, to know what support to give that child, because that's the sort of gaps that exist at the moment. We don't have a unified understanding of what this looks like, and that's why we need these child safe standards. Engage with that self-assessment tool, use it as it works best for you to develop an action plan on where you want to focus your efforts. And that is what the QFCC will be hoping. When we engage with organisations, when we reach out and seek advice and information from you about what you're doing to be compliant, this is the sort of thing we're looking for. And this is a space that's going to continue to emerge and change. So what is good child safeguarding practice on the 1st of October 2025 versus the 1st of October 2030? These are going to look different. We're going to continuously stay in this space, keep learning together, and keep raising the bar to make sure that children are safe along the way. So please stay with this and don't think of it as just another thing you've got to do, another tick and flick. This has real meaningful impact on the lives of children and can really prevent harm as we go forward. So there's our website if you didn't know about it already. You've got our email inbox. We really do encourage you to reach out to your other regulators and your sector peaks, ask for information, advice, what do they know, because we're all part of this together in lifting these standards and raising the bar for Queensland children. And look across those borders. If there's something we don't have yet, the others who have already implemented their legislation may have it. So particularly if you're nervous about that reportable conduct scheme and how your organisation is going to investigate an allegation of reportable conduct, New South Wales and Victoria have guides out there about how to do that already, and they're very good. They go through even to have templates on, how to record conversations with people around allegations, how to give natural justice, all those things. So Queensland will have ours as we get closer to our commencement, but there's so much online. It's not something that you need to be afraid of. Please, we're all here to work together and to raise the bar for Queensland kids. So I've gone a bit over time. I'm so sorry. Look, I will stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you everybody for being able to hang on for a few more minutes. You packed your session, Rebecca, with really critical information and got through so many questions that people have asked. What we'll do for everybody still on the line is we'll go through those questions to make sure we've some of them may not have been answered, and we'll be able to bring that back to the QCN at a later date. So I'm not going to keep you any longer. I see people dropping, but thank you again, Rebecca. Thank you, Ali, behind the scenes, Ali Moore, who's from the CSO team as well. And thank you again to everybody for your time. I'll let everybody leave now, and we will see you again next month, we hope.